nhớ rằng số lệnh số tử đã na của gia hóa nè cả trong xe trả tạo tuần trí này được sở hóa sở cho nó nếu na của gia là nhận ra đã nên cho lưu chùa tuần xá tuần ít ra trâu nhớ là họ của gia bây giờ họ cả của bà thấy cái xe tại đây giờ là còn kể lời rèn của tiếp liền. The entrance to the forest looked unholy as Shokeng sat on his horse with his men behind him. He had pushed his horse to ride non-stop, and the animal's nose had bled wickedly until they reached the forest. As he sat looking at the black opening, he felt his heart begin to pound. His hands had formed sweat, and he was second-guessing himself. But he was here, and he had pushed everyone to their breaking point to get where he was. He couldn't turn back now. One of his men said. He turned to his men and addressed them. Nè nhóm nó, nè tỏ cụ, nè sửa chỗ nu. Giờ ta cá chỗ nu chỉ bỏ cụ trở lọ. Nè mùa hai hóa tại kia tụ tùa. Giờ cụ lỏng để chỗ nu, giờ cụ mà linh trí nè sửa đà. Without waiting for an answer from his men, he got off his horse and began walking into the forest. It was dark, cold and airy, with cobwebs that seemed to embrace him. The tree branches were dead bark that hung low with tangling limbs that lifted its head to look at him slowly. He removed his sword and held it in his hand as he walked across the empty earth. He heard a sound and turned around to find the forest had closed and the entrance was now sealed. Turning around, he saw a light ahead, and he walked until he was led out of the forest into a clearing where there was a pond. It was a green-blue pond with lilies surrounding the edge. The sky began to darken, and a deep fog rose around him. He heard the sound of a tail swimming through the water, and then something appeared out of it. It was a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and green eyes. She smiled at him as she began to walk out. She was wearing a thin white dress, and as she made it out, he saw leeches were on her flesh, sucking blood, and she had no reaction to what they were doing. Katola? She asked in a soft voice. He nodded. A ghost of a smile appeared on her face. He said as he studied his sword. She smiled, and her eyes seemed to glow as she gently walked to him. She began to circle around him, her smile widening. Sure king. Cái tôi đấy tâm bảo lên tôi cái chuyện sinh của thế là. Cô những chịu lấy cả đó có liệu. Cô yêu ở chẳng chừng tao có. Cái lần bề kia sẽ có tôi chỉ cả khai của nè. Ô lên là mà sure king. Cô lúc bề yang câu cô lia. Chỉ hoa tại cả lúc rõ nó, ya chỉ hoa tại mênh mua. Thảo con đó của mù. Sure king recognized the name as the person he was looking for. He watched as she continued smiling, and then he felt something strange about the way how she appeared before him. Guchimu, có cho có tụi chỉ hoa tại lần trí của sư. Vua, ở nhà có chỉ bỏ chạy liò. Bỏ sinh tốt sao bé lưu rõ ý rõ có ấy thật khóa sư có chạy chữ của lý có lo. Có chỉ sao mà là cả. Vì lý cả nên nhá chẳng như xếp hiểu lô à. Tôi thọ kế bá là chẳng tốt ở gì lo thế lo. He smiled. Chỉ ở gì ở mê mỏ. Cô chẳng pha sư. Ý tôi nên trâu đa lý của ở bê râu nó là. Cô ý chính răng nâng tư dùng như kia. She smiled. Cái chính răng cô lên trên đúng mua sư bây giờ. Bây giờ? Giờ lên đó. Kia cô lông lý nó. She có học bên trên cô đùa dạ. She spun once around, disguising herself as Jialia, and the shock caused Shoking to stumble backward. The resemblance was so true to form, and she smiled at him gently. Shoking, she began speaking in his wife's voice. Lama, sunshine go. Cô mà cho con một chiếc hoa tài. La, what ka shate de cô? She reached him in one step and wrapped her arms around him. Leaning in close to him, she whispered to his ears, Sure king. Kia ka lui kia de cô. Mo itu tu de cô. Kia cô ya, tu ya yu ka cha mi nhỏ ka. Kia cô wa ka cha mi nhỏ nia la ma la ka pa ka. He felt his hands begin to tremble and his knees weaken. She continued breathing into his ear, and he dropped his sword to the ground. His heart rate weakened, and the vision before him began to fade. Pain shot through his head, and he groaned as he tried to shove her away without success. A deep, booming voice yelled out from the waters as it split open, and the land began to shake. Shuoking woke from the sound and picked up his sword, slashing the woman's arms in half. She howled as she fell back, and out from the broken waters before them came a man with long black hair and eyes as dark as the night, with a stare that burned. He wore all black as he made his way to where the woman lay shaking with a bleeding, handless arm. He picked her up by the neck, and Shokin watched as the man pierced her chest and pulled out her beating heart. She gasped for breath, and he dropped her to the ground as her body shriveled up into ashes. He squeezed the heart in his hand until it burst and blood splattered everywhere. Shoking began to back up, fear rising in him. He asked. Shoking fell to his knees. He laughed. Chỉ hoa tài, muốn năng sẽ chỉ rong, đông rằng sẽ trả tới tổng đô đô cụ. Cho nên cụ không muốn đi ta, chỉ bảo ye pi lu học bảo lý cả là. Cụ nói để tới cả tia, cái giờ thì sai tệ, cả lu năng nhát ta sẽ học bảo ra chi. Cụ tới đi tốt sao cả, thao cái ba cụ ở tụi ya chân.
Cái gì cả cụ ba cả, cái tốt sao sự, cái tôi của tôi mua cho chị tôi nè, cụ sinh cho cháu nữa sao sẽ thế gì? Giờ lý do nó, cái gì mà để chị là cụ mà, cái sao sai tia, cái tốt sao cho lý nó sẽ, cái gì ở đâu cụ sẽ mua, nếu chỉ dùng ý kia.
Giờ lý cái sao tao ra chi? He laughed, and then he came to stand by his side. He reached a finger and touched Shoking's temple.
Cụ sao tao có lý kỳ sinh, cũng chào bao tên gà xia cho nâng tê tê.
Shoking swallowed the lump forming at his throat. Cụ lý kỳ sinh.
Yeah, more to cụ.
Cái yếu chấp bị chơi mà. He smiled.
Cụ mua xin tao, cụ yếu mà dễ có, cụ yếu cái ta ra sự.
Sai tao tiệt, thầu cụ trả lo. Cụ yếu chính giao cụ ta ra là bây giờ. The king smiled and then walked away from him.
Yeah, cái lúc xia tù, tê rầu, cái chuyện nhân giao tiệt. Tê xia cái lúc xia mua, cái yếu chỉ bảo nữa là. Yeah, có mua là cụ, cũng mà khi có lúc có mua hai tiền lần tia từng tí lúc học bảo tiệt, chỉ tạo lên ta sẽ, cũng mà khó cái lúc chơi mua cái rong cha đâu có ta cái rong đi cũng.
The offer was attractive. Yet Shoking didn't want to lose his memories because it involved his wife. He felt his hand began to shake, and the king smiled at him.
What lý cả, cái rong thao lợi cái chỉ sao xả đi rồi đó.
He asked, Chỉ要chỉ hoa tài. Dạ có thằng được cụ, chỉ cũng mất tao được có. Ôn hình ya chân, bé chỉ mong tư sạp lại bé lưu chỉ sinh. Ya plà mua lợ, tu nên cụ lưu, bé rong ya lý tu nên cụ chỉ bảo. Thầu rong lý nó, tu nên cụ lưu yếu chả ôn hình nhỏ nó. Nên ya chân chỉ hai lần tư, chỉ sạp lại ya nó. Ya nó hiểu ya bé tổ chuột khó chấp lợ. He laughed.
Giờ ya lý có, cụ tê lý sạp tao lắm mà. Cái một xả xe, cái hạ xả lý cả mà ya, bỏ sinh có cho cụ ý rau, ya nó những ya mê mê xin à. Cái chuyện hạ tiệt cụ ya chân cả ta nà, cụ mua mình chỉ sợ. Con tao chỉ ya có tù.
Shoking let out a breath. He was out of choices, and he didn't know what to do. His shoulders felt heavy as the image of his wife swam through his mind. Her smile, her scent, her words, her love. All this would be erased, and he wouldn't know her. But if he held on to his will, would he win over this part of the battle? He looked up at the king. He asked. The king smiled, an evil grin that made Shoking so weak.
giờ nữa tôi cũng lúc lợn trề về coi như là cả nhà thì cái gì lần tưแต่是กู是多用意哦sao bà hai tia cái gì ô li của hai trả tới tổng tu tổ của nó mà một chúng lên đầu tụ tu xì了
Chọn tớ, kể tới giờ cháu mua tớ tua sư, chúng mà tớ trong một giấc chế bởi giờ.
giờ cơ cả quân trẻ giàu thì à
Jialia watched as her mother and father sat at the dining table enjoying a meal together, whispering among themselves as she tried to unwound the pain building up in her heart. It had been 2 days since she'd returned to her parents' palace, and she had been miserable. First, Shuaking had left without letting her see him, and his uncle had delivered her to her parents. Second, her mind had been playing tricks on her, making her have a headache. She was miserable regardless, and nothing could make her feel at ease. Just watching her parents together reminded her of her relationship with her husband. Her mother looked up at her and reached over her hand to touch hers. Minsai, sao san tao mà lo? Kun jeng tia nu po na sư, bao shuo king you takala sache, she said with a smile. Jialia looked down at her food that she'd been ignoring to eat. Kunia, ku lu xie nyot tu liao. Ku chơ chơ nu heng. Chơ le chi na, her father said with a roughness to his voice. Cái bao cái tụi chị chờ giờ để cái chuyện chơ nữa. Cứ đã tế kia sư tụi chị lần chạy nữa na. Ní chúng ta chỉ yon chai liao. Jialia ignored her father's words. Cô yên nữ bao nữ tụi shay. Cô chơ bị, cô nhóc kia đến tận nữ lợi. Chơ san tao à, her mother said again. Cái chi nó mò trái bề cái họ, mò thia. San gì họ kiến yêu xuyên gì đâu nó. She pushed her chair away and stood up. Cô nia, cô nói tao là. Cô muốn tôi kể bề của mày đặc là. She walked out of the mansion and into the garden where her mother had planted tiger lilies and roses. She came to sit and reached her hand to touch the flowers, admiring their beauty. Where was Shoking? Was he safe? She felt tears burn her eyes and she looked up at the night sky where the moon was shining. Lucy, nhớ con họ cô, thở có xa xa một đôi Shoking còn lo chế sai li sai tao. Cô chơ nữa hành. Shoking stood in the darkened room where the king was sitting and began to remove his armor piece by piece. Above them hung what looked like a head that had decayed among recognition. A liquid was bubbling beside him, and the king was enjoying a glass that looked like it was blood.
cái sao ta là lắm bây giờ cái rồi xíu mà cái đi kỹ sinh được của bây giờ
The king asked. King didn't answer for a moment, and when he finally did speak, it was with a saddening voice. After 2 days of hard thinking, King knew it was the only way. He had to remain strong. If he remained strong, he could still fight and win. The king smiled, and he stood from where he sat. He tossed the liquid into the fire, and it hissed, where black smoke began rising. He came down and curled a finger around King's chin.
rong cơ cầu ý chỉ nên của ý sao bảo hay tiền nên ý kiến rong đi cả rồi nó của ý tao chơi à cho đi xuyên trở chẳng nhớ xí à cũng mà thấy có chơi à có sao bảo
He smiled, and then he took a glass from the shelf and filled it up with a bubbly dark liquid. He handed it to King with a smile.
hảo cái hảo ta ý cái chuyện kia xí à cái ý bảo chơi à
With shaking hands, he took the glass from the king and took a long gulp. The liquid was bitter as it burned his throat, and as soon as he swallowed it, it sent him down on his knees, gasping for breath. It seemed to tug on his lungs and throat as he felt it swim around into his body. His veins began to pulsate and became inflamed as the bitterness took over him. He shot his head up to find the king dancing before him with a smile. And then he saw his wife's face coming to his mind, and he found it hard to breathe. But her gentle smile began to pixelate, and it started to tear apart. He cried out as he couldn't remember her name. Shoking! He cried out in pain. He fell to his side, groaning as the liquid began to attack his inside. He started coughing out blood, and images of him and his wife began to rewind and fade. He cried out in pain as he couldn't grasp the memories, and then he saw someone he knew come out into the frame, someone who he never thought possible, stood beside Gongchi and laid out the perfect plan to assassinate him. His eyes opened wide at the presence of this person, and he got to his knees, slamming his fists into the ground. Yavinika! He cried. Yavinika! Yavinika! He began pounding his fists into the ground, crying, screaming until his flesh began to break and blood began staining the floor before him. The king continued dancing and laughing as he pulled all the memories from Shoking that involved his wife. And as Shoking fell over unconscious, the last thing he whispered was, Jialia. The night was silent as Jialia lay in bed covered in a sheet blanket. The fire had died down. She heard the sound of the wind whistling through the half-opened window. As she turned, she saw a dark figure crouched in the corner, and she sat up, her breath uneven as she lit a candle beside her. When light filled the room, she found it was empty. She rubbed her face and let out a breath. She had been having nightmares for the past few nights, and they involved a dark figure crouching in the corner. She couldn't make out what it was, but it frightened her. She also started having dreams of Shoking, and in it, he would reach out a hand to her, but whenever she tried to reach him, he faded into dust before. This frightened her a lot, and she had been lacking sleep. She hadn't heard a single word from his uncle, and it had been more than a week now. The distance apart was beginning to affect her well-being, and she found it hard to concentrate these days or even do simple tasks. Her mind was boggled, and she couldn't breathe at times. She shoved the heels of her hands at her eyes, forcing the tears to stop coming, but they came regardless. Shocking, she cried. Kapanaku, karotila, takala na hokurus tema. Kutona yevi haitia, shocking she thought suche, ligalua to chache. What I get to said as he looked into Jalia's eyes. He was standing before her in the garden, with sadness on his face. She held her heart together as he explained how his men-at-arms had appeared at his mansion after 9 days and explained what Shokeng had instructed them to do. The men had watched him enter and never saw him return. Upon his promise, the men came back to get his help. Jialia fell to the ground and her heart began to pound. Tears rushed down her cheeks and she looked up at his uncle. "Chị hốt tại, giờ nó bây giờ cha?" she asked. "Cô yêu cha cái tao cũng tự trả là, cô tôi nói cô tôi khai có bảo sự." She stood up and wiped her tears. "Cô yên đâu có mù chỉ tao. Giờ có mù cô yêu ở tao li cô yêu lui cha chơi đồ sửa keng. Cô thọ có thế mà?" She shook her head. "Chỉ tao nè, sửa keng ya cô gì ya cũng gỡ. Ya cô chỉ mua chậu nữa lớn từ thế là mua chậu tao nữa. Thầu trong đi nó lại cô yêu chỉ mua bá nữa thế li ta. Cô thọ có chị cũng đâu có mù. Họ cho nó chỉ trong đó có mù nè. Chỉ tao, giờ có bố thế chỉ bố là cũng nhiều đâu có mù cả tao sư." Fana watched as her daughter began packing for the journey, and she came to sit down beside her. "Có bà bảo hay để có ta tạo ra chị. Đây là trong lý nó chưa có ra hơi lớn nè," she said. Jailia's hand stopped, and she turned to her mother. "Chị cũng ra hơi lớn. Số cái gì của tụi chị nè của nhà. Ôi lý thế lý chị cũng ra hơi lớn nè. Họ tiền có yêu chữ ba车của lúc rõ sao. Cái gì của yêu mà của lúc xưa nè. Yêu của bảo thôn cho hai để yêu trong lý nó của như chỉ bố có một yuan nữa ít sao liệu. Của nhà. Thầu pin có thứ hai ta có cho lưu. Của chỉ tôi chỉ nhận của chỉ tôi chỉ yuan. Rồi nó, của tôi mình đang nấu ăn tàu cho xin đấy lý nó là. Của lúc xưa của tôi mất ta rồi số cân nữa. Giờ mua tấm bằng khó từ, cô yêu chủ yếu tôi mua bá cả tao nữa trả cá lò chơi. Cái sự mua cái sao xe bảo nữa sao đó? Cái bảo bảo ai tiệt? Nếu một lần con bảo lấy khó có sao nữa cơ mà? This caused her to frown and turned to her mother with a confusing stare. Cô nhỉ? Ít chữ cái như khe của cô cho rong sơ sa. Ôi chàng hôm nào có yếu chỉnh cô luôn đi. Vì cô chỉ sao bả cái nè. Cô trai để trả có mù vậy có chỉ cho là. Cô lú có. Đó có chỉ sao mù. Kia chỉ hoa tại kia từ mù sư, chỉ tao đi lo. Cái gì từ bên nhà sư có một tủ lại ra chỉ mù nữa. Jialia tied her bag of clothes and looked up at her mother. Cô yêu muốn cho cô tự xin $1 chơi. Cô chân tao tia, giờ khát tấm mừng nó nửa bao là giờ cũ số kinh nghiệm ấy dạng gạo cũ như chỉ cho nửa trẻ sau giờ họ luôn nên từ khi kéo lụt ta là giờ mò cũ xứ chỉ trong đó chỉ thầu cũ tí tệ nửa giờ tụi lo cha cũ sợ giàu nó thầu nướng to quê chỉ một chút nửa tệ cất giờ bỏ trong thế chỉ bỏ trong lọ nửa chia có tấm mừng. Without waiting for her mother's response, she grabbed her bag and left her chamber. Downstairs, her father was standing by the door, and he handed her a dagger. She looked at him and then reached out a hand to take it. Thầu có trưởng dâu, có nông hải tìa, có cuộc hè có tuần ta tuần nành, tuần su. Thì she cũng trai tìa, chả cũng plá có một trò hạ trò họ trò. Cô thấy lý chia có nhau rồi ta cả. Nó là cũng chân to tìa, có lúc bệnh sự cho cả tàu có tụt xí có tuần gỡ đó là chạy. Khán đó có mù. Do tìa thầu yếu she ghê, she got cho she sinh nằm. She wrapped her arms around him. Ôi chào cô gì? Một cho cả tàu, số kinh trạc là sao chạy. Ôi cháu, ở đây sẽ là chẳng tì là cổng, cho lưu chúa tuần xá. Cô và hai tiếng đây sẽ là nông ra đã nâng là để cô yên trí kể lời chuyện thật của thía. Tôn gì, yếu tờ sẽ sai tận tay nào đó mà, bé mà lấy xin gì đó.